Hello, friends, and welcome back to Stories About Entitled People. Our first story about why you should always read contracts when you get a job. But before we begin, don't forget to subscribe to our channel if you're new here and turn on notifications so you don't miss a new video every single day. And our first story. Boss, your hours are 9 to 6 as per the employment contract. My boss had a talk with me earlier in the year about my hours after I got a promotion. I went from 9 to 5 to 9 to 6 apparently, and I didn't know, so I continued to leave at 5 p.m. as usual. He said that it was in my employment contract that I signed when I took the promotion. I went home and read it, and it said 10 to 6 with an hour lunch. For the past 8 months, I've been coming in at 8:30 and having a 30-minute lunch. I was kind of annoyed that HR didn't point out that I was now entitled to an hour lunch. In retrospect, I should have read through everything, but really though, does anyone expect their lunchtime to change like that? The next day I came in at 9:28 a.m. and he said that I was late, and I said, "No, I'm not. I'm 32 minutes early. You said the employment contract had my hours, so I went home and reread it, and it said my hours are 10 to 6. So while I don't come in at 10 a.m., I still do take my time and come in at 9:20 because it gives me time to relax and have my coffee in the morning before starting my day. It's the least I can do for being forced to shift my entire workday an hour like that." Always read contracts. Your bosses will screw with you, accidentally or intentionally, for the rest of your working life. That's guaranteed. But if you know the contracts, rules, and laws, it'll happen far less often. And our second story. Next week, I'm going to fire you. Worked for a crappy airline company. Let's just make up a name. United Airlines. At this company, they started a smaller company that could hire and train people to run the planes, but pay them way less at certain airports. Where my colleagues at other airports were making over $20 an hour, I was getting paid $10.25 for the same and sometimes more work. It honestly would scare you to know how little the people who are the ones that make sure your plane takes off safely are paid. All of us had 2 to 3 jobs to be able to pay rent, and we were all in the job for the benefits, free flights to anywhere in the country on standby. Anyway, I had a boss. We'll call him Jim. I could tell many stories on how terrible of a boss he was, but this one has actual malicious compliance. I had to go to the hospital from the airport because of intense pain in my stomach. It turns out that because of stress caused by that job, my intestines decided to stop functioning. Anyway, I spent the day in the hospital, and they gave me a note saying that I didn't have to work the next 2 days. I told Jim's boss that, since I hated talking to Jim. When I went back into work 3 days later, we had 5 people total to load all luggage, load the water, and push out 5 planes in a little over an hour. Already an incredible amount of work for so few people. We had our morning work meeting to discuss how effed we were. Then Jim asked me into his office. "Your attendance is unacceptable," he said. Dumbfounded, I asked what he meant. "You've been late a couple times and now missing the past 3 days." I said, "Jim, I have the note from the hospital. According to work policy, that shouldn't affect my attendance." "I don't care what the work policy says. I'm going to fire you." Again, I cited work policy since we were protected by a union. I said, "Jim, you have to give me an attendance warning before you're allowed to fire me for attendance. This is the first time I'm hearing about attendance, so you can't fire me right now." Jim said, "It doesn't matter. I'm going to give you a warning right now, and when I get back from vacation next week, you're going to be fired. Now, go back to work. My decision is final." So I told my coworkers what happened. Then I decided, all right, well, if next week he's firing me, I'll just leave now. Even though their day was about to be effed since now 4 people were working 5 planes, they all just said, "F this place. Let's get out of here." So I left and went to get breakfast. This all happened at 4 a.m. As I'm enjoying my meal, Jim calls me. I happily ignore. He calls 3 more times, then texts me asking where I was at. I told him, "You fired me. Why would I keep working for you?" No response. I try to soak in the sight of Jim running between planes like a chicken with his head cut off. I don't imagine any plane took off on time that morning. I get a call from HR and the union rep and the general manager who's Jim's boss. They all said Jim was wrong and asked if I could come back to work it out. But quitting felt so good, and I felt such a weight lifted off my shoulders thinking about not working there anymore. so I never went back. Some more info. Although this isn't so satisfying, it's more a testament of United Blair Line's complete lack of ethics. Jim got in really big trouble when he had a guy who had a shoulder injury and had a note and told Jim several times that he couldn't do super heavy labor. Jim sent him to the bag room by himself anyway. Imagine having to lift 300, 750 to 70 pound bags over your head per hour, all while running between bag carts and the belt. Needless to say, the guy tore his shoulder and had to get surgery on it. They still didn't fire Jim. Instead, they promoted him to manage the workers who did ticketing and no manual labor. As far as I know, Jim still works for United. My coworker still can't move the way he used to 2 years later. And our last story. How my grandpa became the owner of a gas station/garage. My family immigrated to America in the 1880s and settled in Nebraska. We were farmers for the first 80 years or so, but back in the 1960s, my great-grandma decided she was going to sell the entire farm before she died and simply give her sons 1/3 of the money for inheritance when she passed. She had 3 sons. In 1969, my great-grandma passed, and her 3 sons inherited the money she had earned from selling the farm. My grandpa decided he would basically let that money sit until after he retired from the military. In 1971, he deployed to Vietnam for his second and final deployment. At the end of his deployment, he returned to Nebraska and retired after 22 years in the service. Now, he had an old Chevy truck at the time and was in the process of building a concrete business with the money he'd gotten from his inheritance. Well, during this time, his truck engine blew up. My grandpa was busy at the time and didn't want to fool with the truck because he was busy, so he bought himself the engine he wanted to replace it with, which was an upgrade, and he went down to the only garage in town and asked them if they'd be willing to put the engine in the truck. They agreed on a price and told him to come back in a week or so. A week later, my grandpa comes back and picks up the truck. He admits he felt like a fool for not double-checking the work, but assumed since this was the son of his friend that the son would do right by him. This was a small town. Well, my grandpa opens up the concrete business, and he's busy, and the time comes for his first oil change. It's about 4 months after he got the truck back. He's doing the oil change, and he notices that the engine he bought isn't the engine in his truck. It's a smaller engine. This obviously POs him to high heaven, as my grandma liked to say. So he storms on down to the garage to talk shop. Earl was the owner. Earl comes out and denies any wrongdoing, says he did as he was told, and it shouldn't have taken him 4 months to bring the issue up. My grandpa tells Earl he needs to do what's right. Earl refuses. It's important to note this is a small town. Written contracts and so forth aren't really a thing. Your worth is your word. My grandpa tells Earl he's going to get him for this. Earl laughs and tells him to leave his shop. My grandpa goes down to the county and requests the record for who owns that gas station. Turns out that it's an old family friend named Harold. My grandpa stops by Harold's house and starts inquiring about the business deal Harold has with Earl. Harold says Earl rents the gas station/garage from him. My grandpa asks Harold how is everything going, and Harold confides that Earl hasn't paid his rent in 2 months. My grandpa asks, "Do you have a written lease with Earl?" To which Harold goes, "Nah, I sure don't." My grandpa then asks, "What if I bought the gas station/garage from you?" Harold isn't completely on board with the idea, but my grandpa makes a strong point. Earl isn't paying his rent, Harold doesn't seem like he has much interest in being a landlord anymore, and my grandpa has the cash to buy the place outright. Harold, sensing something is up, asks my grandpa, "Did Earl do something to you? You seem awfully interested in this garage. Ain't you busy with that concrete business of yours?" And my grandpa fills Harold in on the story. My grandpa also mentions that he has a son, my father, who needs something to do, and he'd be happy to buy the whole building from Harold for a fair price, and what happens after that is his business. Also, it's important to note, when Harold decided to rent this business to Earl, in that deal went all the equipment and tools that Harold had acquired over the years, so those belonged to the building. Harold and my grandpa came to a number that they both agreed on. A few days later, Grandpa paid Harold in cash in full for the business. The paperwork is done, and my grandpa's now the proud owner of a gas station and mechanic shop. Now, my grandpa senses that Earl ain't going to be too pleased when my grandpa fires Earl, so for the extra good measure, my grandpa calls up the local sheriff, who's a high school friend, and asked the sheriff to come with him to break the news to Earl. So my grandpa and the sheriff go down to Earl's now former business, and they walk in. And before my grandpa can even say hello, Earl says, "Now I told you I didn't cheat you." My grandpa smiles and said, "I'm not here about my truck. I'm here to fire you." Earl, with a look of confusion on his face, asks, "You can't fire me. I own this business." My grandpa shows him the title and says, "I'm now the owner of this building," to which Earl fires back, "But I got a deal with Harold." And the sheriff speaks up, "You do? Do you have a lease?" "Well, no," Earl says, to which the sheriff smiles and says, "In that case, you're going to need to take your stuff and leave." Earl is fuming, PO'd, grabs his toolbox, and storms out. My grandpa ended up hiring the mechanic that would occasionally work on his trucks at his concrete business. He had my aunt and grandma run the gas station full-time, and my dad would work there after school. We owned that garage for 25 years before my grandpa sold it to someone else. Never mess with ordinary-looking people. You never know how much money they might have to ruin you with. Hey guys, thank you all for watching the video. I'll see you in the next one.